Philip Goff is a professor of philosophy at Durham University. A well-known panpsychist, he is the author of several books such as Galileo's Error. Michael James is a leading scholar of Advaita Vedanta as taught by Bhagavan Sri Ramana Maharshi, the foremost Indian sage of the 20th century and a translator of his original Tamil writings.
Welcome, Philip Goff, and welcome, Michael James. Tonight we're going to be speaking about consciousness, suffering, and God. And Philip is going to ask the first question of Michael. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Sean. Thank you. And well, firstly, just thanks so much, Michael, for taking the time to have this conversation. I'm really looking forward to learning from you. And thanks, Sean, for hosting it. Well, I thought maybe we could just start by, as it were, putting our cards on the table. I just wonder if you could spend a few minutes telling me about your core views on mind and spirituality more generally. I think I have some understanding of them, but it would be great to, and obviously a few minutes isn't much time to get all the details, but just to give us a gist to start off with, maybe.
Okay, so I follow the teachings of Bhagavan Ramana Maharshi, and so I'm speaking from the perspective of his teachings because that's my core. My views are all centered around his teachings. The starting point and the core of his teachings is who am I? When we first introduce who am I, it's first a question, but the reasoning that proceeds from this question is just the preliminaries. What he's actually teaching is not the question, who am I, the investigation, who am I, investigating what we actually are. But in order to investigate what we actually are, we need to have a clear conceptual understanding of what we are and what we are not. Otherwise, we'll be investigating the wrong thing. So it starts off with reasoning to understand what we actually are. In traditional or classical Advaita Vedanta, it begins with a process that is called neti-neti, which basically means not this, not this. It's reasoning about what we are not. Bhagavan begins from a more positive, takes a more positive approach to it. He first says what we actually are. What we actually are is just awareness. But we all experience ourselves as if we were a person consisting of body and mind. The analysis is a bit deeper. It says that we identify ourselves with what are called 5 sheaths. That's the physical body, the life that animates it. That means all the physiological processes, breathing and etc. The mind, which in this context means the grosser functions of the mind, the perceptions, memories, thoughts, feelings, emotions, and so on. Subtler than that is the intellect, and subtler than the intellect is the will. So these 5 make up what is called these are called the 5 sheaths, and these constitute the person we take ourselves to be. But none of these are what we actually are. And there's several in tradition, in classical Advaita, they have what are called prakriyas. These are different lines of reasoning to understand why we are not any of these 5, or we're not the bundle of these 5. One simple one is considering our experience in the 3 states of waking, dream, and sleep. Now we experience ourselves as if we were this body. But in dream, we experience ourselves as another body. If this body were what we actually are, we couldn't be aware without being aware of this body. We're always aware of ourselves. We're always aware I. But in dream, we're aware of ourselves without being aware of this body. So this body is not what we actually are. And likewise, now we're aware of ourselves without being aware of any dream body. So the dream body is not what we actually are. But in both states, it's essentially the same mind in both states. But there's a third state, sleep, in which in which we don't experience any mind. We don't experience any phenomena whatsoever. But we exist and are aware of our existence in sleep. This is a point that many people have difficulty grasping. This is one of the fundamental premises of Advaita, but we are aware in sleep. Generally, the general understanding of people is that sleep is a state of unconsciousness. There's no awareness in sleep. But according to Advaita, what is absent in sleep is not awareness, but phenomena. We are aware without being aware of any phenomena. We're not aware of time, we're not aware of space, we're not aware of body, mind, anything, but we are aware. We are aware of our own being. But obviously our being is not an object of awareness. All phenomena are objects of awareness, but our own being is not an object. So we're aware of our being just by being. Our being itself is consciousness. Consciousness is what we essentially are. So by just being as we are aware of our being, because awareness is always aware of itself. That is, to be aware of anything entails being aware, but we're aware. So awareness, self-awareness is the core of awareness. So we are always aware in all three states, but whereas in sleep we are just aware, in waking and dream we are aware and aware of phenomena. So the awareness of phenomena is what, Bhagavan taught in Tamil, but the Tamil term we can translate into English as the awareness we experience in waking and dream is transitive awareness. That is, we're aware of objects. Whereas in sleep, it's intransitive awareness. We're just aware without any awareness of objects. Logically, this is a reasonable position to take because we cannot be aware of objects, of phenomena, without being aware. But there's no logical reason why we shouldn't be aware without being aware of phenomena. And if we consider our experience in sleep, though we generally consider it as a state of unconsciousness, when we wake up from sleep, we are aware of having been in a state in which we were not aware of anything. That's how we view it from the perspective of a waking state. But in order to be aware of having been in that state, we must have been aware. Supposing there were no awareness in sleep, our experience would be an uninterrupted sequence of waking and dream states. But we are aware of a gap between these states. Those gaps we call sleep. Sleep in the sense of deep dreamless sleep. So the fact that we're aware of a third state means we are aware in sleep, even though we are not aware of anything. So the basic contention is, since the only thing that we experience in all three states is our awareness of our own being, that is what we essentially are. Because if we can be aware of ourselves without being aware of another thing, any other thing, like the body or the mind or anything, we and the body and mind cannot be numerically identical. Because if we were numerically identical, whatever we say of one thing has to be true of the other thing. So if we were this mind, we couldn't be aware of ourselves without being aware of the mind. Since in sleep we are aware of ourselves without being aware of the mind is not what we are. That is what we identify with, but it's not what we are. Like that, there are a number of ways of distinguishing ourselves as awareness from everything else. All other things are phenomena. Phenomena are things that appear and disappear in awareness. We are the awareness in which phenomena appear and disappear. Since they appear and disappear in awareness, or in the view of awareness, however we want to word it, there must be something, awareness must be something distinct from them. They may not be distinct from awareness because we don't know anything outside of awareness. So it's reasonable to suppose that whatever appears in awareness depends upon awareness for its seeming existence. But awareness exists independent of all these phenomena because awareness can exist in the absence of phenomena. But as I say, this is just the preliminary reasoning. But even if we go through all these different lines of reasoning and clearly understand why we are not any of these, this bundle of, this person we take ourselves to be, this bundle of these five sheaves, we still experience ourselves as such. I am still experiencing myself. I am sitting here. I am talking. That's all because I'm identifying with this body. So to actually experience ourselves as that which is distinct from all these things, as that awareness that is distinct from all these things, we need to investigate ourselves. So the core teaching of Ramana, of Bhagavan Ramana is self-investigation. Self-investigation means turning our attention back on ourselves as awareness. In other words, awareness being aware of awareness. We as awareness being aware of ourselves as awareness. So it is a type of meditation, but it's meditation unlike any other meditation, because in other forms of meditation, there's an object we're meditating on. In this case, we're not meditating on any object. We're meditating on the subject, the knower. I think that's a fair summary of the essence of the teaching. Of course, there's a lot more to it than this, but this is the very heart of the teachings.
Fantastic. That was very, very helpful. And it was very interesting that there was sort of the lines of argument there. I suppose you could justify it in one sense through attention to your own experience, but in this case, you're partly at least justifying it with building up these arguments. And so it's slightly reminiscent, obviously not exactly the same, but of Descartes' argument for the distinction between the mind and the body. He says, because we can conceive of one without the other, and this shows they must be separate. Something like the same principle there, not the same argument.
It's somewhat the same principle, but there is a distinction. That is, Descartes is often considered as the starting point of modern philosophy. The equivalent of Descartes in Indian philosophy is a philosophy called Sankhya, which is also a dualistic philosophy, but it is fundamentally different to Descartes' dualism. Descartes is a body-mind dualism, whereas Sankhya is essentially a subject-object dualism. That is, everything that we take the mind to be, all the thoughts, the feelings, the perceptions, the memories, this, according to Sankhya, this is all clubbed along with all physical, all phenomena collectively are clubbed together as what is called prakriti, which means nature, but we can't. We can't. There's no adequate translation. But the idea is all phenomena are something distinct from the awareness. The awareness is called Purusha, so it is a subject-object duality, whereas Descartes is a mind-body duality. Is the distinction clear?
Yes, I think so.
Yeah,
yes. Yes. So the end point isn't the same. Just the sort of what one principle in that reasoning was similar, at least, but the end point is different. Yeah.
Sankhya is one of the most ancient philosophies in India. It's very difficult to date any philosophy in India because, for example, a lot of philosophies were systematized in the early centuries AD, around 2nd century AD or so. But both philosophies had existed for long before that. They just weren't formed into systems. So Sankhya probably goes back at least 2,500, 3,000 years. And that is not a Dvaita, but that's a dualistic system. They believe there are two independently existing things, just like it's a substance dualism. There are two substances.
The two things are the objects of thought and the
consciousness and the phenomena.
Right. Good. Okay.
And the phenomena exist independent of consciousness. But until they come into contact with consciousness, they're what is called avyakta. That means they're unmanifest. They become manifest when they come into contact with consciousness. But this is not a Dvaita. According to a Dvaita...
I see. That's what's going to be my next question.
Yeah, consciousness alone is real. The phenomena have no existence independent of the consciousness.
Right. Got it.
But Advaita accepts the distinction that Sankhya makes between consciousness and phenomena. It's just it doesn't accept that phenomena have any independent existence.
So Advaita doesn't, sorry.
Advaita doesn't.
Advaita, yes. Good. Maybe we could just ask one or two more questions just before I lay my cards on the table. So just to clarify, I guess what I'm really interested in, well, I'm interested in all of this, but so the thing that I ultimately am is awareness. And is that, this might not be the right way to put it, you correct me, is the thing that I am the same as the thing you are ultimately? Awareness. Yes. Oh, that was a nice, easy answer. Okay, one more question. One more slightly different question. Could I just say a little bit? I'd love to hear a little bit about your spiritual practice, or is
well,
if that's okay.
There are two ways of explaining that. That is, Bhagavan often used to say there are two ways: either investigate yourself or surrender yourself. But that was. He said that to people who didn't have such a deep understanding of the teaching he was talking about. Because in his deeper teachings, he made it clear that self-surrender, that is, surrender means, in the path of devotion, in the path of love for God, what stands between us and God is our will. That is, God has a will, but we have a will of our own. We have our own likes and dislikes. So in the path of surrender, the first thing we try to surrender to God is our will. That is, we try to give up our likes and dislikes. Thy will be done. Your will is my will. That's happiness for me. That's the initial endeavor in the path of devotion. We're trying to surrender our will to God. But so long as we remain as a separate entity, we cannot but have a will of our own. We may be able to reduce the strength of our likes, dislikes, desires, attachments, and so on, but we will always have, to some extent, a will of our own. So in order to, we cannot surrender our will completely without surrendering ourself, the one who has the will. The one who has the will is not the fundamental consciousness that we are, but an intermediate entity called ego. Ego is the I that identifies itself as I am this person, I am this bundle of 5 sheaves. That is the I that has likes, dislikes, desires, and so on. So it is that is the self that we seek to surrender. And Bhagavan has taught us that the nature of ego is to rise, stand, well, let's put it this way. Ego cannot rise, stand, or flourish without constantly grasping form, as you put it. In other words, without constantly being aware of phenomena. We seem to be ego so long as we're aware of things other than ourselves. So the very nature of ego is always grasping things other than itself in its awareness. But if ego turns its attention away from the phenomena back towards itself, there is no such thing as ego to be found. That is, we seem to be ego only so long as we're looking away from ourselves. When we look back at ourselves, ego subsides and dissolves back into its source, into the pure being from which it rose, the pure being awareness from which it rose. So the means by which we can surrender not just our will, but the one who has the will, namely ego, is by the practice of self-investigation, which is turning our attention inwards towards ourselves. Inwards doesn't mean towards thoughts or feelings, anything. They're all external. Inwards means towards I alone.
How do you do that? The only way I meditate every day, actually, but I just meditate on my breath. Also, how do you draw
it's more subtle than any other form of meditation, because in other forms of meditation you have an object you're meditating on, breath or whatever it is. But though awareness is not an object, we are always aware. We're aware of our being. Our being is awareness. So we are all aware I am. Whatever we may be doing, the awareness I am is the background. Sometimes Bhagavan compared it to the screen in a cinema. When we go to the cinema, we sit there for 2 or 3 hours looking at the screen, but we never, though we're always looking at the screen, we never notice the screen, because we go there to watch the pictures, whatever is happening. Because our whole attention is on the phenomena, we overlook the background. It's not that we're not aware of the background, but we overlook it, we neglect it. So this fundamental awareness of our being, I am, is the background on which all experience arises and subsides. So though our being is not an object, we are always, we never cease to be aware of our being. So it's sometimes described as self-remembrance, just remembering our being. That is shifting the attention away from, not just the attention, but our interest, away from what appears and disappears, back to the one to whom it appears and disappears. That back to the one in whose view it appears and disappears. It's a very subtle form of meditation, but if we grasp it, once we've got a grasp on it, it's very clear that this is the power of this. But the problem is essentially it's a very simple thing to do, but it's not even doing. We're just being aware of ourselves. There's not even a doing there. But because the mind has so much liking to hold on to things other than itself, our attention keeps on going away from ourselves. So to hold your attention on your breath is relatively simple. But to try and hold, well, yeah, I said relatively. I said relatively.
Yeah, no,
but yeah,
sure.
but to hold your attention on your being is much harder.
Nowhere to begin.
But because it's not that it's difficult. It's that if you're standing on the edge of a cliff, to take one step forward and fall off the edge of a cliff, it's very easy. But can you do so? The reason you can't do so is because you're unwilling to do so, because you know if you take a step forward, you're going to be a nasty mess at the bottom. So just like we attending to ourselves is actually very easy, but it seems to us very difficult because of our unwillingness to do so. Because when we attend to ourselves, our separate existence is dissolving. And because we hold on to, for our very survival, we hold on to things other than ourselves.
That's a fascinating analogy. That really makes a lot of sense. That's really helpful, Michael. Should I say just a few things about
Yeah. Please.
where
I've
I'm
talked
coming
too
from,
much.
and then
I've talked too much.
It was my fault. I was asking the
Yeah.
questions because I kept wanting to learn more.
Yeah.
But yeah, well, maybe just I suppose in my thing, it's more of a divide maybe between the mind stuff and the spirituality stuff. And the mind stuff, I suppose, what I've spent most of my career on, and turning myself to the spiritual stuff is maybe a more recent development, although of course these things are interconnected in all sorts of ways. But yeah, very briefly on the mind stuff, I suppose I spent my career defending this view, panpsychism, the view that consciousness goes all the way down to the fundamental building blocks of the physical universe. I think it's a question for physicists what the fundamental building blocks of the physical universe are, but supposing they're fundamental particles like electrons and quarks, then the panpsychist would add that those fundamental particles have incredibly simple forms of experience, and then the complex experience of the human or animal brain is somehow built up from those simpler forms of experience. So I suppose the attraction to this at the start is a deep dissatisfaction with the current paradigm on consciousness, what we sometimes call physicalism, the idea that we could completely explain consciousness in terms of physical science, in terms of patterns of neural firing in the brain, for example. Now, almost everyone agrees that that project has gone completely nowhere. We've never really managed to explain a single experience in those terms, although that's different from the science of consciousness making progress. I think we can distinguish those two things. I actually think also it's just an incoherent project. So it's not surprising we haven't made any progress, because I think it just doesn't make sense when you really think about it. Maybe we could talk about that, or maybe there'd be too much agreement on that. But so panpsychism offers an alternative. And I think what it's doing, or at least the kind of panpsychism I like, is just turning that upside down. And there may be some commonality here, perhaps. Rather than starting with physical reality and trying to get consciousness out, we start with consciousness and try to get physical reality out of that.
Right.
And the inspiration here is important work by Bertrand Russell in the 1920s. And I mean, his core claim really was, I was just writing about this morning in my new book, actually, to try to think of different, more clear ways of articulating Russell's insight. It's just that, in a sense, physical science isn't telling us what space and time and matter are. And that sounds really weird. You think, of course it is. That's what it's in the business of. But actually, but Russell's point was physics is just pure mathematical structure. And mathematical structure is very abstract. I mean, and pretty much anything can implement mathematical structure. It could be a computer program, if it's complicated enough, could run the mathematical structure of physics, which is why many philosophers think, oh, maybe we're in a simulation or something. If it was a computer running the mathematical structure of physics in our universe, then we'd be in a simulation. I wrote just this morning in this book I'm writing. So, it could, in principle, be people on walkie-talkies. If you had enough people communicating through walkie-talkies, if you had as many people as the number of particles in the universe, and they were communicating in a really disciplined, law-governed way, that could, in principle, give you the mathematical structure of physics. And people that you'd think, well, that wouldn't give you black holes and Big Bang, but then once you think that, you're in the mindset of thinking, well, physics is telling us about the substance of the universe. But no, it's just telling you about mathematical structure. You could get that mathematical structure through lots of people talking on walkie-talkies. So I just wrote that this morning and thought maybe that's a more vivid way of making the point that it's sort of like physics is sort of like software, and it could run on lots of different hardware. So the panpsychist says, well, maybe the hardware is consciousness. So if you had, the hypothesis would be you've got lots of simple conscious entities. There are other ways of running this we might get to, but just thinking of particles for the sake of simplicity, simple conscious entities interacting in simple, predictable ways. Through their interactions, they realize these patterns and mathematical structures that is physics. So you get the software of physics out of the hardware of consciousness. Okay, so so I don't think you can get consciousness out of physics. I think that's incoherent, but we know you could in principle get physics out of consciousness. Okay, so that's the mind stuff. Spirituality stuff. So I've recently returned to a form of Christianity. I self-identify as a heretical Christian, just to kind of flag up it's maybe a little bit non-standard in certain respects. And just briefly, I suppose there are head and heart reasons for the motivations. So the heart reasons are more, well, let's do it the other way around, actually. The head reasons are more coming to think both sides of the endless debate between God and atheism gets something right and something wrong. So I think traditional theists can't explain suffering. Why would a loving or powerful God allow so much suffering, create a universe with so much suffering? But I also think there's things traditional atheists can't explain, like the fine-tuning of physics for life, this surprising discovery that many numbers in physics need to be in a very, very narrow range for life to be possible. And it just looks more than astronomically improbable that those numbers would be in the life-permitting range just by chance. So I think there's something theists can't explain, there's something atheists can't explain. And so my most recent book, Why the Purpose of the Universe, I explored the sort of neglected middle ground options. So thanks for the advert. And one I'm particularly attracted to, it's not the only one I consider in the book, is a God of limited power. And I've just become more and more attracted to this. I think you can articulate it quite precisely, this hypothesis, and I think it can explain the fine-tuning in terms of God's purposes and the suffering in terms of God's limitations. So I think this is really, seems to me, where current evidence is pointing. So that's the more kind of head stuff. And then the hard stuff was, I suppose, learning about the other thing I've been writing about in this new book, the mystical traditions of all the Abrahamic faiths. I always knew spirituality, I always knew Buddhism and Hinduism had deep spiritual depths, some of which I've been learning about tonight, but I had no idea that sort of the Abrahamic traditions also had the mystical traditions. And, particularly the Eastern Orthodox Church, very roughly, the core ideas, I'm sure you know, Michael, just in case people listening don't, that the aim of existence is for God and humanity to become one, to become unified. Now, not in the sense, so this might be where there's subtle nuanced differences here, that not in the sense that we are God, even in our fundamental being, when we're not identical with God, but it's more the oneness of a married couple, perhaps, that we will one day be in this deep, intimate, unified relationship, which Jesus gets at with the metaphor of the vine and the branches. If one thinks of the intimate relationship between a vine and the branches, they're not the same thing, but there's a deep, intimate, organic unity between them. And then the idea is that the Jesus stuff sort of facilitated this, because God needed to share in our form of existence so that we can share in God's form of existence, so we can enter into this unity. And then just very finally, I suppose, so I guess this was something that really resonated with me, with the mystical traditions I've always taken seriously. You have that oneness that you find in all mystical traditions, perhaps a different interpretation of that oneness. That might be interesting to discuss, how that oneness differs to the mystical tradition you go for. So it resonated in that way, but also I've come to think, and this is where it all connects up very finally, that it fits quite well with a God of limited powers thing. Not that Eastern Orthodox Church believe in a God of limited powers, but I think it makes a lot of sense. So I guess my interpretation of Christianity is that God's trying to make a perfect universe, but sadly God can't do it like that, right? The only way God can make a perfect universe is to make an okay universe, and then when it's evolved enough, bring it to perfection by becoming more intimately bound up with it, sharing in our form of existence so that we can share in God's form of existence. So it's going to be all right in the end, but we're not quite there yet. So that was where the sort of the head and the heart come together. So yeah, so just funny. I'm not actually a member of the Eastern Orthodox Church, because I don't believe in everything they believe in. I think the core of their beliefs I do accept, but I'm, don't sign up to everything. So I think I found my spiritual home in the combination of the mysticism of the Eastern Church and the liberal flexibility of the Anglican Church. So that you've got, I like that. I think that's and it's part of what I want to say in this new book. I mean, it's a book actually that's reimagining religion for the 21st century. So it's just trying to get people to think again about, you can engage with religion and get a lot out of it whilst avoiding many of the things you worry about. But part of what I want to convey, what I've found is that combination, I think is working for me. It might work for other people too. Anyway, but that's I talked a bit too long as well.
No.
Yeah. So
okay. Yeah, that's very interesting. But there are several fundamental questions I would ask in response to that. Firstly, when you say that you say that fundamental particles have some form of consciousness or experience. Firstly, what exactly do you mean by consciousness? How would you define consciousness?
Yes. So I guess I adopt the definition that's standard in analytic philosophy and science, that it's just subjective experience. Your consciousness is what it's like to be you. Now, I think that is compatible, perhaps, I would say, you might disagree, with the views you've expressed there, that we can distinguish two components, the awareness and the objects of consciousness, or the phenomena, as you put it. For example, Miri al-Bahari, very good, analytic philosopher, who's
I know,
very,
I know.
yeah, as I said it, I'm sure I realize you probably know who.
Yeah.
Or just for people watching or listening, she's very much in the Advaita Vedanta tradition, but spelling it out in the style of analytic philosophy.
Yes.
So I would say it's compatible with that, but doesn't. Just throw in there as well. I always talk about particles, I suppose, but many theoretical physicists are inclined to think fields, universe-wide fields, are the fundamental things. So if you marry that with panpsychism, then you get that the fundamental forms of consciousness correspond to these universe-wide fields, maybe only one universe-wide field. So maybe that makes it a somewhat, maybe entirely compatible, I don't know, with the views you're expressing, but I don't know. I'll hand it back over to you.
Okay.
What do you think?
What it is like to be something, or what is experienced, that is what we are aware of. That is the object of awareness. And anything that can be described as what it is like is what we are experiencing. Consciousness, the definition I've come across this definition a lot. I mean, I'm aware that in modern analytic philosophy, this is the usual way in which consciousness is defined. But to me, that is a fundamental confusion, because it's putting consciousness on the wrong side of the equation. Consciousness means the attribute, we can say, of being conscious. So what is conscious is not what is experienced, it is what is experiencing. In other words, the experiencer is consciousness, not what is experienced. So to me, all phenomena are objects of awareness, not awareness. Like, as I said, we all are, if we come back to our own experience, we all experience ourselves as if we were this body and mind. But though we experience that, that cannot be what we actually are, because we are, as I said, well, I gave a few of, there's so many arguments that can be given, but I outlined a few of them earlier. Because anything that appears and disappears in our view, we must be something distinct from that, because we exist even when that thing is not appearing, even when we're not aware of that thing. So whether it's particles, or what it's like to be a human being, or what it's like to be a bat, or what it's like to be anything, it's all that is okay. This classic thing, what's it like to be a bat? The difference between being a bat and being a human being is the content of awareness, not the awareness. The awareness is that in which all these different experiences arise. So because we now experience ourselves as if we're human beings, we have a certain set of experiences. Because a bat experiences itself as being a bat, it has another set of experiences. But in both cases, that which is experiencing is essentially the same. If we distinguish what is aware from everything that we're aware of, then awareness is like, as I said, it's like the screen in the cinema. Whatever is projected, you can have a human film projected, you can have a bat film projected. One film can show what it's like to be a bat, another film can show what it's like to be a human. I'm not saying literally a film can show what it's like to be a bat, but I mean, there's a set of experiences which is like something projected on a screen, but the background screen, the awareness, is the same in both cases.
Yeah. So I guess, well, how we define it, and as you know, this comes from, as you know, Thomas Nagel and his what it's like to be a bat paper. But actually, using that terminology for consciousness was used earlier by Timothy Sprigg, who was kind of the only panpsychist in the analytic tradition, earlier in the 20th century. And although he didn't quite define consciousness using those terms, but he used those terms to capture it. So I always feel it's a bit sad that he gets missed out from that. Anyway, but we use that. So what we say is, some think is conscious if there's something that it's like to be it. So yes, we're characterizing it in terms of the phenomena.
Yes.
But we're not necessarily pointing to the phenomena rather than the thing that's experiencing the phenomena.
Right.
And yeah, so I suppose I would say I'd say that way of thinking about consciousness is compatible with something being separable, awareness itself. And I guess I'm agnostic. Let me try to disagree with you, just to the extent that I'm not. I mean, there's two ways one could be persuaded. One could be persuaded through meditating and realizing this, and I haven't done enough meditating. I wish I'd started meditating before I had children, which is it gets tricky now. Try to do 20 minutes if I wake up before the kids. Anyway, or if I have insomnia. But just in terms of the argument, so you're right that the phenomena change, and over time. But does that mean it's separable from us? Here's another view. Could it, what if one says, well, it's a modification of the mind? It's not that it's something separable from the mind. Let's say the color red I'm seeing now. It's this view is sometimes called adverbialism, from like an adverb. So it could be that the phenomena are a modification of my mind. And I'm open to maybe there are two things here that can't be separated from each other. That the mind and the phenomena, maybe they're separable in that we can conceptually distinguish them, but they're like maybe one could say it's like having three sides and having three angles. You can distinguish them, but you can't separate having three sides and three angles. So I'm not saying this is my view, but I'm not sure why the arguments, as opposed to meditation perhaps, but the arguments rule out that kind of view. What do you think?
Okay, what I would suggest is if we want to study consciousness or awareness, we first, in any scientific endeavor, you first have to isolate in some way, whether in actual physical terms isolating, or at least conceptually, you have to isolate what it is you want to study. Because if you mix up what you want to study with other things, you've got too many variables. So in some way or other, you have to isolate the what it is you are studying. So if we want to study consciousness, I think it's very important that we distinguish consciousness from the objects of consciousness. What you say about it being modification, yes, I think it's perfectly reasonable to say all phenomena we can say are mental modifications of the mind, because even the physical phenomena of the world, we don't experience the physical phenomena. We experience a mental impression of the physical phenomena. So in that sense, it's a modification of the mind. But even within the mind, I think we have to draw a distinction. The mind consists essentially of two elements: the knower and the known, the subject and the object. All our perceptions, memories, thoughts, feelings, likes, dislikes, intellectual processes and everything, these are all things that are experienced by us, whereas we are the experiencer. So when we use the term mind, for example, sometimes we use the term mind in the sense of what we're experiencing, the thoughts, feelings, and so on. Sometimes we use the term mind in the sense of what is knowing all these things. So I think it's important to draw that distinction. So I think if we want to distinguish the knowing element of the mind from all the known elements of the mind, we can say the knowing element of the mind is ego, the I that is experiencing all this. all the other elements of the mind are what is known. So they are objects, phenomena. Ego is the subject, the knower. And I think that distinction is very important to recognize that distinction. I'm not advocating for dualism here, because I don't think that, I'm not saying that anything that is experienced exists independent of the awareness that is experiencing it. But I think the distinction is to make that distinction is very important. If we want to study awareness, study consciousness, we need to distinguish it from everything else.
That's so interesting. So, and where did the phenomena come from? So, I'm just to catch that a little bit, I suppose. So, as I'm understanding this, and this clarifying the metaphysics here, you know, I'm understanding awareness is the foundational thing. Awareness. So, in a more Christian idea, you have, you know, God is the foundational thing. God, there's a causal relationship. God creating new things.
Yes.
But if I'm imagining, tell me if I'm thinking of it wrong, you know, in the beginning there was just awareness, as it were. I mean, maybe there is no beginning, but even if time goes back infinitely, it's sort of foundational level. So even if it's not temporarily backwards, sort of in terms of the hierarchy of being, as it were, there's just awareness. So why do phenomena? Where did the phenomena come? What explains the existence of them? I suppose, I mean, that's part of why I suppose I'm attracted to the Abrahamic faith. To some extent, I'm drawn to what Western philosophers call cosmological arguments. You know, why is there something rather than nothing, or there must be a necessary being to explain these things. Now, to be clear, I don't think you get God out of all this. I think maybe you get, in my view, a necessary being. There must be something that explains its own existence and explains the existence of everything else. So these arguments get dodgy, in my view, when you start adding and it must be omnipotent and it must be all powerful and it must be good. It always seems to me to get dodgy then, but that there must be something that explains its own existence and explains the existence of everything else. Otherwise, why is all this stuff here? You can trace it back to the Big Bang, but why? I mean, maybe the quantum vacuum is the necessary being. I'm not saying what it is, but there must be something that is foundational and that explains its own existence and explains the existence of everything else. Do you think you agree with that? And how would that fit into Bhagavan's picture? I mean, is awareness the foundational thing, and then how do the phenomena emerge from awareness?
Okay. First, I would give an argument that is somewhat parallel to your argument of physics talks all about the structure of things. It talks about what things do, but it doesn't talk about what things are. I'm not taking that argument, but there's a certain, it's in some way analogous to the argument I'm going to offer. All phenomena are finite things. And every finite thing is defined by its limitations. What distinguishes me from you, this person from the person you take yourself to be, is that this person is limited. There's a body, there's a mind, there's certain limitations. So all phenomena are limited in one way or another, whether we're talking about physical phenomena or mental phenomena. We distinguish one thing from another by their limitations. But in order you cannot have limitations without something that is limited. So if you want to find what is the ultimate substance, you have to remove the limitations. If you want to find what it is that is limited, you have to remove the limitations. So if you remove one layer of limitations, you get limitations below that. So you have to peel off all the limitations. When you have removed all limitations, what remains?
The unlimited.
The unlimited, yes, the infinite. So I would say, and I think this is also the basic idea in all religions, but the fundamental reality is infinite. And consciousness fits the bill perfectly there, because consciousness seems to be limited, because now I experience myself as I am this body, so this, or I'm this person, so my consciousness seems to be limited to this person. Your consciousness seems to be limited to your person. But if we remove all the limitations, which are phenomena, the underlying consciousness, where are the limits on consciousness? Arguably, the entire universe is contained within consciousness. So, there's no limits on consciousness. And consciousness, I'd say, is essentially the same as being. Being and consciousness are the same. So the infinite reality is infinite being and infinite awareness. This is a definition that is given in the Upanishads for Brahman. Brahman is defined as Satyam, Jnanam, Anantam. Satyam means being. Jnanam means awareness. Anantam means infinite.
And then do the limitations emerge from the unlimited?
Well, they seem to have emerged. This is another argument I would give here. If you understand this argument, then from here, if the ultimate substance, the ultimate reality is unlimited, the unlimited can never be limited. Because if it was if something that was unlimited became limited, it would be limited by time. It's only unlimited for a certain, but even time is a phenomena. It's a limitation. It's a phenomena. It's an object of experience. It's not it's not awareness. So that which is infinite must always be infinite. It can never become finite. So finite things are appearances. What actually exists is only one infinite being awareness.
So does that mean nothing? Oh, sorry.
Yeah. So all phenomena, they seem to be, but though they seem to be, they do not actually exist as such. Everything exists as that infinite being awareness, but as finite things are just appearances.
But the appearances don't even exist. I mean, so nothing is real apart from the infinite?
They seem to exist. Everything is real as that infinite being awareness. If you see a rope and mistake it to be a snake, that snake is unreal as a snake, but real as a rope. Likewise, all finite things are unreal as finite things, but real as the one infinite ground.
I just struggle to make sense of this. Maybe I just haven't meditated enough. But okay, I can understand. There's nothing real there. There's just the seeming. But okay, but then there's the seeming. So there's something that's distinct from the foundational one. There's the seeming.
Yes.
And does that, and then so there's something, I mean, does that,
yeah, okay.
I want to say, does that causally arise from this?
Okay.
But it can't be that nothing's real.
Nothing can seem to be, except in the view of something that is aware of it.
Yeah.
Some modern philosophers say consciousness is an illusion. To me, that is, however you try to argue it, that is absurd, because you cannot have an illusion without something that is aware of that illusion.
Hmm.
So to say that that which is aware is an illusion is it basically it leads to an absurd nihilism.
Yeah, yeah, but it seems like you're almost saying the parallel of that, which I'm finding maybe not as hard to make sense of as there's no consciousness, but still a little bit hard to make sense of that. That there's, it seems like you're saying there's nothing beyond the foundational thing, but there is ignorance, right? There is
This,
ignorant states of mind.
all these things all we can say is yes, there seem to be.
There seem to be, but then there's the seeming. I don't know.
Okay,
It does.
yes.
Is yeah.
But
Or
even
where does this?
even the seeming is seeming.
I mean, maybe there's some kind of connection here to something we might want to talk about. You know, where does suffering come from? Where does bad stuff come from? So I think this is a big problem for all, pretty much the big religions, and the way I answer it, as I've already said, in with my own faith, is that I think it's the result of God's limitation. So I think, so where does all this stuff come from? Some of it pretty bad. Well, God's created it. Okay, but then why has he created bad stuff? Or she or they? Because it's gonna be good in the end, and this is the only way God could do it due to God's limitations. So whatever else you said, but there's at least a sort of clear story of why suffering exists. Of course, we can argue about there might be problems with this story, but there's at least a clear story of why stuff exists and why some of it's bad. But on your view, or on Bhagavan's view, or why are the bad things? If there's really just foundationally, or really just one thing, this unlimited one perfect thing, why is the bad stuff? Where did that come from?
Okay, there's one more idea that is, I said that the ultimate reality, which is called often referred to as Brahman, but it doesn't matter what we call it, Brahman or God or whatever it is, it's infinite being awareness. It is also infinite happiness. That is our real, what we actually are is infinite happiness. But when we limit ourselves, when we seemingly limit ourselves as a finite being, suffering is inevitable. That is the embodied condition. That is what is called samsara. I don't know if you're familiar with the word samsara. It's used a lot in Indian religion. Samsara is basically the state of embodiment, and that is the bondage from which we are seeking liberation. When we limit ourselves, we cannot experience the infinite happiness that is our real nature. So we are all dissatisfied. Nothing can satisfy us except infinite satisfaction, infinite happiness. So when we limit ourselves, seemingly limit ourselves as a finite being, we inevitably suffer. Suffering is just the nature of limitation. Because once you've got limitation, you get pairs of opposites. The ultimate reality is infinite being. But when you have finite things seem to come into being and cease to exist. So you've got existence and non-existence. It is the infinite reality is infinite awareness. But when you have finite things, we don't have infinite awareness. We know only a little. We have awareness. The range of our awareness seems to be very limited. We know some things, other things we don't know. Likewise with happiness, once we are limited, our happiness is limited, and that brings suffering into existence. Because the one thing we all what is that driving force behind the efforts made by all sentient beings? Ultimately, we're all seeking happiness or satisfaction. We seek it in so many different ways. Some people seek satisfaction in earning lots of money. Some people seek satisfaction in, those of us who are philosophically inclined, we seek satisfaction in discussing these things, trying to find answers, raising questions, trying to find answers. This gives us satisfaction. Other people find satisfaction in so many things. I mean, there's so many ways in which we find, but whatever we experience, nothing, we experienced finite forms of satisfaction, but we are never fully satisfied, because nothing less from the infinite happiness that we actually are can satisfy us.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, just maybe a comparison there to sort of one spiritual direction. Yeah, so I think I'm quite lucky that I'm not naturally driven to power or money. But
thank God.
but hold on, but I do have some ego, I do have some ambition, and
we all have some ego. That's the problem.
and I think, I mean, where I try to direct myself in terms of, you know, my spirituality is to direct yourself. So I believe, or I have faith. Difficult question, the connection between faith and belief. I think faith isn't the same as belief. Anyway, that there is some greater reality emerging, in line with how the Eastern Orthodox Church thinks about it, sort of the transcendent and the universe coming together. And so when I pray every night and I say, "Let thy will be done," what I'm saying there is trying to orientate myself to seeing what I'm doing in some small way, in data, as contributing to that greater. And I found that's brought me greater happiness in helping me with my ego and my ambition to just slowly bring myself back to that. And he helps, you know, think that you're only ever going to be a tiny part of that. And it sort of takes the pressure off a bit. You know, it's like, you know, made the bet. It's always going to be a tiny contribution, but you know, you do the best you can, and try and have fun along the way. But the
more we can reduce ego, the more content we will be.
I think that's the thing I've got most out of. You know, some people think,
but whatever contentment we as ego experience is finite. What we are all seeking is the infinite contentment. That is out of our grasp so long as we experience ourselves as a finite being. So but though we seem to be a finite being, no finite being can exist independent of the infinite ground of all being. So what we all ultimately are is that one infinite reality. You said earlier that our being cannot be one with God. But if we have any being other than God, then God is thereby limited. But God, by very definition, I mean, the concept of God doesn't make sense if God is something finite. Then he becomes just one phenomena among so many. But if God has to, I mean, to me, the concept of a finite God is there may be, I mean, there may be the appearance of finite gods, but the ultimate God, the ultimate reality has to be infinite.
Yeah. So I guess this would be a disagreement with my view then, wouldn't it? I suppose well, I mean, it's not that God is not infinite in some respects, but God is more limited than what we could conceive of a being without such limits to power. And I suppose there what I think is, I suppose I think that, well, again, in the Eastern Church, you distinguish between the essence of God, which is completely unknowable, and the energies of God that sort of pervade reality and we can become involved with and become acquainted with. But we are completely, we don't know the core of God's essence. So I guess my view would be that it's a question for anyone, I think, well, why does God exist? Why is there not nothing? It seems that I think you might disagree on this actually. We can conceive of there just being nothing. Why is there anything? I think if you could really grasp the essence of God, you'd see, oh my God, this thing has to exist. And it has to exist as it is, with these limitations.
Yes.
Just as there are limitations, necessary limitations in reality we do know about, like no contradictions. I don't think you can. That's a limitation of reality in a sense that we know about. So I think if you truly grasp the essence of God, those limitations to God's power would be like the fact that you can't have contradictions. It'd just be like, oh yeah, God has to be this way, and God has to be so. But just so it's more, I think, from our finite state that it seems, oh, there could be something without those power limitations, but that's just our finite minds, in my view.
The thing is, so long as we remain as something separate, we cannot know God. God cannot be an object of knowledge. If he were an object of knowledge, he would be something finite. As the infinite ground, as the infinite awareness, he cannot be an object of knowledge. So God is unknowable let's say God is not knowable in the way that we know finite things, in the way we know the objects of the world, in the way we know our thoughts and feelings, because he cannot be an object. How we can know God is only by being God. How do we know ourselves? And when I say know ourselves, I'm not talking about the person we seem to be, but we all know, removing all the accidents of what we seem to be, we are aware of our being. We are aware I am. How do we know I am? We don't see it as an object. It's not an object of the senses. It's not even an object of a mental object. We know ourselves by being ourselves. Likewise, God knows himself by being himself. And since God is the infinite fullness of being, there cannot be anything other than him. If I am something other than God, then God is thereby limited. So if we accept that God is infinite, unlimited, and not just, if you say unlimited in some respects, that is limitation, because those respects are limitations. God is infinitely infinite. There's no respect in which God is not infinite.
But can God defy contradiction? Can God defy the law of non-contradiction?
Contradictions arise only among finite things.
I see. It's interesting. Another thing, this book I'm writing, I was discussing the work of the Sufi mystic Ibn Arabi, I think 11th century maybe, and he makes a very similar argument to what you just made. Then that God is unknowable because to make something the object of knowledge, you limit it. He said even Allah is not God, which is funny for a Muslim to say. Because Allah is our way of relating to absolute reality. But well, maybe this would be a good point in this to connect to something we discussed a little bit in an email before the show. And you're thinking you wanted to say, well, this is a misunderstanding of Bhagavan's view, but I have this way about how we place love in this. If there's ultimately one thing, it seems to me, and I'm happy to be corrected on this, that for love you need two things. And what I love about the idea of self-sacrifice is that it's not you, but you do something for this person that's not you. So then, in my understanding of Christianity, in the end, we will be in this deep unity with God, but we will still not be God. So there's still difference between us and God, between us and each other, difference with deep unity. Actually, I just say very briefly, and the Last Supper monologue in John's Gospel, there's so much talk of oneness. There isn't talk of, oh, God needs someone to punish for your sins, as the Protestant reformers decided was the case. And people think that is Christianity. But Jesus talks, it's all this oneness. I am one with the Father, and he talks about this sort of two things being inside each other. So and that rings to he says, like, I am in the Father, the Father's in me. I am in you, you are in me. I am in you, and you're in the Father. So like, and when I think of that, it's like paradoxical, isn't it? That two things can both be inside each other. So to my mind, it's like as intimate as, it's a love where it's as intimate as you can possibly be, but it's not. But it's still not identity. Anyway, so how can you have love without difference?
Yes, when Jesus said, "As I am in you and you are in me," then does that not suggest he said one, I can't remember the exact passage, I think it's in John's Gospel. He says, he prays that they may be one, as I am one in you and you are one in me. May they be one in us, something like that.
Yeah.
If you have one term that is often used in I think all spiritual traditions that I'm aware of, is the word heart. Heart in the sense of the very center, the core of everything. And it is said God dwells in the heart. But God not only dwells in the heart, if God is something inside the heart, he is the heart of the heart. That is, whatever is inside something, that is the heart of that thing. So if God is the ultimate heart, if God is the ultimate thing in the heart, he is both the heart and what is in the heart. That is, if there were anything in God, that other thing would be the heart of God. So when Jesus says, "As I am in you and you are in me," to me that is, and particularly when he's talking about oneness, to me that is a statement of oneness. That is, God is in the heart and he is the heart. Because he is the ultimate heart. He's the ultimate core of everything. He's the heart of everything. He's the heart of you. He's the heart of me. He's the heart of everything.
Yeah, it's obviously difficult how to understand these things, but I suppose I interpret it not as it's oneness, but it's not quite as identity, but as in some closer than you can conceive of, intimately bound up with each other. But how can you have? But don't you need difference of some kind to have love? How could you? Otherwise, it's just loving yourself, isn't it?
Well, yes. I'm just going to ask you: don't you love yourself?
No, I love myself. Yes, I suppose so.
We all love ourselves. That is, all love is a movement towards oneness. And as you said, love is about giving. So if we give ourselves wholly to God, what remains? Only God. And that is why it is said, our giving ourselves to God is God giving himself to us.
I just think it's more wonderful when the giving is to someone who's not you. I don't know.
that is God. So long as we limit ourselves, we seem to be separate from God. So we are giving ourselves to something that seems in our view to be separate from ourselves, but it's actually the reality of ourselves, what we essentially are. So we are giving up the limited self to merge in the infinite self that is God.
Right. Do you believe, what do you think of free will? Does free will figure into it? I've had conversations with Annika Harris, who's written about panpsychism, and she's done a lot of 10-day meditating and a lot of meditation. And she claims that, you know, once you've meditated enough, you realize there is no free will. But then it seems to me different people who've meditated very seriously think different things. What do you think about free will? I'm curious.
I always wonder when I hear philosophers or others talking about free will without unpacking the idea. That is, when we talk about free will, are we talking about will or are we talking about freedom of will? But those two ideas are conflated. And usually, if you listen to what people say about free will, they're not actually talking about will or about freedom of will. They're talking about freedom of action. So we need to first distinguish these things. Do we have a will? I think that no one can reasonably say we don't have a will. We all have likes, dislikes, desires, attachments, and so on. So if we accept that we have a will, then the next question is, do we have freedom of will? The term in Sanskrit for freedom of will is Icha Swatantra. Icha means will, liking or desire or whatever, will. Swatantra means both freedom and independence. If you're independent, you're free. If you're dependent, you're not free. So freedom of will means independence of will. We all have likes and dislikes and so on. Is there nobody can make you like what you don't like. No one can make you dislike what you do like. So in that sense, our will is independent. So if we accept that our will is not determined by anything external to ourselves. The form of our liking. For example, some people say, people's likings are conditioned. If you're born in South India, you like rice. If you're born in North India, you like chapati. If you're born in Italy, you like pasta. So they say likes are conditioned. That is the particular form of a liking, but the actual underlying liking, not what it's a liking for, but the underlying liking, that is, that I would argue we have independence. And then when it comes to action, I would argue also we have independence of action. But though we have independence of action, this is according to the teachings of Bhagavan, we have independence of action, freedom of action, but we do not have freedom over what we experience. So, for example, I can like to be the president of the United States. I can try to be the president of the United States, but unless I am meant to be the president of the United States, I will not be. So I could, a more simple example, I could very much like to be a professor of philosophy like you. I can try to be a professor of philosophy, but I have to study. I have to get an MA. I have to get an MPhil and a PhD and things. And even then, it's not sure. But I mean, it's very few people end up becoming professor of philosophy. Many people study philosophy. So I can like that. I can make effort for it, but it cannot happen unless it is meant to be. So. And as far as the freedom of will is concerned, I can go into it even more deeply. That is, desires are a grosser form of the will, subtler than the desires of the likes and dislikes. We can like something without necessarily desiring it, but if a liking becomes strong, we then desire it. Your neighbor may buy a flashy new car, and you say, "Oh, I like your car," but that doesn't necessarily mean you have a desire for it. You're very content with whatever car you've got, but it looks very nice. Yes, I like it. I like that painting. I like this. I like that.
Right.
It doesn't necessarily. So liking is a that is a desire. Is a more developed form of a liking, but the likings arise out of inclinations. The term used in Sanskrit there are two terms actually: vasana or samskara. That is the basic inclinations that give rise to the likes and dislikes, which in turn give rise to the desires and attachments and everything. So in the subtlest form, the seed from which all likes, dislikes, desires, attachments, and so on arise is from these inclinations. So the will in its most basic form consists of countless inclinations. These inclinations are constantly rising in our mind. Where our freedom lies is that inclinations are inclinations. We are not bound to follow our inclinations. So, for example, take the example of someone who is a smoker. Because they've been smoking for many years, they have a strong inclination to smoke. If they haven't smoked a cigarette for an hour or two, they've got a craving for that. But they've also been told by their doctor that if you go on smoking like this, you're going to kill yourself. So they know it's bad for their health. They want to be healthy. So they have an inclination to be healthy. They also have an inclination to smoke. So there's a battle going on within their will between the inclination just to have one more cigarette and the inclination to avoid it.
Right.
Where our freedom lies is what inclinations we have now all come from the past. If we happen to be a smoker, it's because we've been smoking for so many years. So the inclinations come from the past, but we have the choice which inclinations we follow. So when there's the inclination to have just one more cigarette, there's also the inclination, no, let me avoid it. Those who are not able to give up smoking is because they keep on yielding to that inclination. And because they yield to that inclination, that gets stronger and stronger. But if they have the so-called willpower, if they are determined, no, I need to give up smoking, I don't want to have a premature death, let me resist it. Whenever that inclination arises, let me resist it. Then slowly, because they're not allowing themselves to be swayed by that inclination, the inclination gets weaker and weaker. And after some time, that drops off entirely. And people who have smoked in the past and later given it up, they say, I cannot imagine why I ever had a liking for it. But while they were struggling to give it up, that liking was so strong. So where our real freedom lies is the inclinations we have from the past is what is our present bank account, so to say. We can't change the inclinations we have at this very moment. But what we can do is we have that freedom which inclinations to follow. And if we avoid following a certain inclination, that inclination becomes weaker, and the inclination we follow becomes stronger. So that is where our freedom of will lies.
Thanks, Michael. That's fascinating. Really interesting distinctions there. Well, you've given me so much to think about. Unfortunately, I'm probably going to have to close things up. There's so much more I want to talk about, but that's been incredibly helpful, and I feel I have a deeper understanding of the position. I suppose at the end of it all, I'm still stuck with this issue. Where does it all come from? Where does
where it all comes from? There's no doubt. It all comes from the. It must come from the infinite. If there's no other place it could come from. If it comes from a finite thing, that finite thing must. The ultimate source of everything must be the infinite.
Right. Well, I'll continue to reflect, and I hope at some point when my kids are a bit older, able to do a sort of extended meditation, which I don't know why I didn't do. Yeah, I did meditate for my kids, but never done a very long meditation. So I would like to. Maybe I'll change my mind on some of these issues. Yeah. But yeah.
Does the idea of meditating on your own being, your own fundamental awareness, I am, does that appeal to you to give it a try?
Absolutely. I sort of feel like, I don't know how you'd start doing that, but then your wonderful analogy about you can do it.
That's why it's called the Sanskrit term for it is vichara. Vichara means investigation. So the only way to in any investigation, when you start an investigation, the direction is not very clear. You have a vague idea what you're looking for. But as you go deeper and deeper in the investigation, the way forward becomes clearer and clearer.
Well, thank you very much. I will definitely give that a go at some point.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining us, Philip and Michael. That was a wonderful conversation that gave us a lot to think about, and I really admire both of your work so much, and I really appreciate what you guys are doing. So thanks a lot for spending time with us and sharing your thoughts.
Yeah, and I'm sure we've got a lot more we could share if we had more time. But anyway, it's been very nice. Thank you.
Absolutely. It would. Well, we should do it again sometime. No, that's been very helpful. It's given me a lot to reflect on. Thank you, Michael, for taking the time.
Okay, my pleasure.